Well, good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here. And before our panel begins, and on behalf of myself and my fellow panelists, I want to offer a very warm and enthusiastic thanks to Diane Zorich and John Blundell and the entire Digital Programs Office at the Smithsonian for their exceptional work to make this program possible. Thank you so much. I'm Ann Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and a former member of the National Portrait Gallery curatorial team. And although I'm no longer employed by the Smithsonian, I'm thrilled to say that I feel very much a part of the larger Smithsonian community. And I'm grateful for everything that the Digital Programs Office is doing to make sure that that really is a national and international community. Between 2012 and 2014, I had the pleasure of serving as president of the College Art Association, during which period CAA undertook the creation of a code of best practices and fair use for the visual arts, a document that was published in 2015 thanks to support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. We're grateful to Lauryn Guttenplan, among others, for their essential contributions to this endeavor. The goal of CAA's code is to educate readers about the parameters of copyright and the role of fair use in providing access to copyrighted materials for analytic, educational, and creative purposes. Today, I'm pleased to be able to moderate a panel that addresses another key dimension of access for researchers, educators, and all members of the cultural heritage field, the topic of open access. Over the course of the past day and a half, I've been struck by how frequently open access has emerged as a goal and even an imperative of the many projects and endeavors we've heard about. As many of you may know, the history of open access is quite long, and in some ways is contiguous with that of the development of the internet itself. One of the first open access projects may be Project Gutenberg, started in 1971 by Michael Hart with the digitization of the Declaration of Independence. Project Gutenberg now boasts over 50,000 objects in its collection. The term open access, however, came into common parlance more recently, largely through a cluster of events, gatherings, between 2002 and 2003. In 2002, the Budapest Open Access Initiative advocated for making publicly funded research publicly available. This was rapidly followed in 2003 by the Bethesda Statement on Open Access Publishing and the Berlin Declaration on Open Access to Knowledge in the Sciences and Humanities. Each of these events further solidified the principle that open access and impact go together. So, just how can one facilitate open access to facilitate impact? And just what do we mean by open access anyway? To address these important questions, I am joined by three experts: Rachel Allen, Martin Kalfatovic, sorry Martin, I may be butchering that, I apologize, and Lauryn Guttenplan. It's my pleasure to offer introductions for each of them. Rachel Allen is Deputy Director of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, a position she has held since 2002. Prior to that, she served as Chief of the museum's Research and Scholars Center. With a background in resource development and information management, Allen has overseen a number of the museum's large database programs, including the nationwide effort called Save Outdoor Sculpture, with its related database, the Inventory of American Sculpture. Martin Kalfatovic is the director of the Biodiversity Heritage Library and Associate Director of the Digital Programs and Initiatives at the Smithsonian Libraries. At the Smithsonian Libraries, he is involved with scholarly communications, mass digitization, education and outreach, and product development and licensing. As Program Director for the Biodiversity Heritage Library, or BHL, a global consortium of more than 60 natural history, research, and botanical garden libraries, he directs the aggregation of content, global partnerships within the larger biodiversity world, and fosters collaboration and community among partners. Lauryn Guttenplan, Associate General Counsel at the Smithsonian, joined the institution in 1985. For many years, she has concentrated on issues involving copyright, digitization, open access, and has served as a member of the former Secretary's Executive Committee for the Digital Smithsonian. She has also served as chair, co-chair, and faculty for the annual Conference on Legal Issues in Museum Administration, co-sponsored by the Smithsonian and the American Law Institute. She was a member of the Legal Advisory Council for CAA's Code of Best Practices in Fair Use, and a member of the Drafting Committee for the Association of Art Museum Directors Guidelines on Fair Use. We will lead this morning with Rachel, who will speak to SAM's long-standing commitment to linked open data, then move to Martin, who will discuss the Biodiversity Heritage Library, or BHL. Lauryn Guttenplan will offer the panel's final set of formal comments discussing key considerations for determining whether particular sets of information can indeed be provided using open access parameters. Each of our discussants will speak for approximately 10 minutes, after which I will moderate a discussion among them. We will then open the panel to the floor for further questions. And on that note, I want to remind those individuals who are watching via live stream that we look forward to hearing from you too. The conference hashtag is hashtag SIDIGI, SIDIGI, and the hashtag for questions is hashtag SIDIGQA. Thanks so much.
So good morning, everyone. So I'm pleased to bring you up to date with the activities of the American Art Collaborative. And this is a museum partnership that Sam has been leading. I'm going to cover the basics of the partnership, what we're doing with linked open data, and then why I think these are important steps in digitizing for impact. The AAC, I'll use its acronym, the AAC Collaborative consists of 14 partner museums. 3 Smithsonian units are part of the mix, SAM, NPG, and the Archives of American Art. The museum partners are from a very diverse range of organizations, from museums with very strong technical expertise and support to smaller institutions that have a very limited capacity. AAC has been working together now for 3 years when we first received a pilot grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to explore linked open data for museums. The Mellon Foundation remains one of the funders of the current phase of work, along with the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So the learning curve on linked open data was really steep for most of us in this collaborative, and so a really huge benefit of this project was learning together, solving problems together, and developing a common understanding and language. We've also worked openly to share what we've learned with others as we move forward. We've had several observers to the process, and all of the information about our project is available on a website. So let me start with a few of the basics. Linked data is about using the web to connect and share related data on the web, or in this case, the semantic web. And the semantic web, the name the semantic web was coined by Tim Berners-Lee for a web of data that can be processed by machine. Let me parse out a few of the words. May seem simple, but they're sometimes overlooked. So linked open data is about data that's linked or connected to other data. It's open, as in shared publicly or accessible, and it's data, as in broken into its most discrete parts so it can be intelligible to machines or machine readable. You can have linked data without it being open. You can have open data without it being linked, but you really need all three to have linked open data. So where I think linked open data really is important and has impact is by giving meaning and context to your information. So in the next few slides, I'm going to delve a little bit into how that meaning and context is provided and adds value. So this is a typical object page from Sam's website. This is what you see when you call up this painting by John Singer Sargent from our collection. And most of you in the audience will have no trouble reading this page or understanding its meaning. It follows all the typical museum object label protocols, artist title, date, dimensions, and so on. But this is what the computer sees. This page isn't machine readable, it isn't linked, it's devoid of descriptive context that the computer can understand. So overall, it doesn't fulfill the promise of the semantic web. So to provide meaning, linked open data depends on mapping data using one or more ontologies. And an ontology really is a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows the properties and relations between them. And so for our project, for the American Art Collaborative, we elected to use the CRM, or Conceptual Reference Model, as our primary ontology. And the CRM was developed by and for the cultural heritage community to provide a common framework for publishing our information. The CRM provides the means to describe the things we collect, the people or actors who created or interacted or used these things, and the events and actions that have taken place about them. So this slide is just showing you one little piece of the CRM mapping. There are many more slides, and when you knit them all together, you have the mapped model of how we put our project together. It's important to point out that other disciplines have other ontologies that they would be using if they were mapping to linked open data. So in the sciences, there would be very specific ontologies for your specific disciplines. So this is just a picture of the American Art Collaborative's process in converting our information to linked open data. It goes from preparation of data, mapping and conversion, to RDF, reconciliation across the data, publishing to a Sparkle endpoint, and building an application on top of the data. And I'm not going to walk through this diagram, but I just wanted to flag that there are a number of steps to using and managing linked open data, and there are a number of additional steps if you're doing it as part of a consortium of users. So just to close the loop on our John Singer Sargent painting, this is the same page with the information expressed as linked open data. And while it's not a page that pleases the human eye, it is a page that a machine can read and use. So at SAM, we're publishing our linked open data through a Sparkle endpoint, as well as on our individual object collection pages, as you can see here. And then our linked open data is also part of the combined data set of the American Art Collaborative. So I said I was going to address meaning and context. Well, what provides the context? And this, to me, is one of the really crucial parts of what makes linked open data powerful or impactful, to use the word of this conference. It's not linked open data unless you link it to other data. Well, why is this important? It's important because other experts have data that may be more valuable and more authoritative in their subject areas than the data we hold. And when we link to these sources, we extend our knowledge and we provide value to our holdings by providing the context for our work. So let me give a few examples. For the American Art collaborative, we elected to link our names to the Getty's Union List of Artist Names, and there are many other linkages we could have made. We just didn't have time and resources within this project. But the one step of linking to the Getty Union List of Artist Names added value to our records by providing all the extended information that the Getty has compiled over 30 or 40 years for variant names, birth and death places, relationships such as teacher-student relationships with artists, parent-child relationships, and links to other repositories that also collect information about these particular people that we care about. The linked data cloud represented in this slide you see begins to suggest the endless possibilities for linking data. Early on, at SAM, we linked our records to the New York Times. This provided information about where artists exhibited and critical reviews of their works. Already, others have crowdsourced SAM's linked data, and using the Wikidata Mix and Match tool have linked our records to the Wikidata Hub, making our records more discoverable and providing a broader context for our information. The more links you or others add, the more value the information takes on and the greater possibility for tracing links to find new information. It's one reason why the collaborative was really excited to have the Archives of American Art as one of its partners, because it was really easy for us in the art community to imagine the fertile research pathways that could open up by linking between museums and archives. So take a moment, if you will, to imagine research in a future world where the art data links not just to like art data, but is extended through the world of knowledge. It's not hard to imagine this interconnectedness here at the Smithsonian, and certainly this morning's talks have all suggested that. But in this future world, an inquiry to natural history about hybrid corn might eventually link back to a 19th century painting in Sam's collection that shows a painted depiction of an early corn species, or an inquiry about Sam's new acquisition by the artist Tom Mutek, showing wildlife from northern Minnesota, leads you to the migratory bird specialist at the zoo and the native language studies at NMAI. So cross-disciplinary research is really part of the future potential of linked open data that could be unlocked in the future as more information is contributed to the linked open data cloud. So our grant period is coming to a close at the end of this month, and we've accomplished a significant amount of work in the 2 years we've been working under this grant, but there's a lot more that we need to do. I just want to close by giving you the website of the American Art Collaborative. Here you can find the history of our project, all the educational presentations that we participated in together, links to the GitHub site where the American Art Collaborative data is stored, and also where all the nitty-gritty technical discussions took place among the partners. And then soon we'll be publishing a good practices guide that will be highlighting some of the things we think you should think about if you wish to start a linked open data project. So thank you all.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Martin Kalfatovic, and I thank Anne for her valiant attempt at my last name. It's a great challenge. I'd also like to thank Ian Owens and the panel this morning for giving a good preview to the BHL, Biodiversity Heritage Library, and so I can just jump right to the chase on a lot of things about the importance of openness to providing impact through this type of open access to digital collections. So every day when I go to work, I pass a sign in the Natural History Museum that talks about the vast library of life, which talks about the specimen collections, the 2 to 4 billion that are available globally that Ian mentioned. And what I like to think is that the BHL has really provided the library component to supplement and to provide context for those specimen collections. And together, the specimens in the library do create a vast library of life. The BHL has been around for about over 10 years now, and we've worked collaboratively to inspire discovery through access to biodiversity knowledge. And it's really this key part of our vision in terms of providing access to this 250 to 300 years worth of information that's really important. It's also important in terms of working with the researchers around the world. Nick Pyenson, one of the researchers at the Natural History Museum here, has talked about the speed and efficiency to scholarly communications that the BHL provides. Oops, actually I'm one behind, sorry about that. We like to think that we're squirrels with capes. So again, accelerating the research efficiency for free is the value proposition that BHL provides to our researchers. Just some quick numbers, we have about 53 million pages so far, which represent about 213,000 volumes of digitized text. That's the size of a medium to large natural history collection if you look at libraries around the world. What I'd like to highlight also are two things. The first one is those 179 million name references that we have in BHL. So again, through a taxonomic intelligence tool that was funded partly when Maureen Kearney was at the NSF, we've developed a way to actually identify species names within the text and to be able to then potentially link those back to other collections going with the linked data model that Rachel was just mentioning. But I'd also like to highlight in terms of openness, our negotiations with intellectual property holders. We've worked with over 300 intellectual property holders. Those are publishers, journals, they are smaller societies around the world, and they've given us permission to provide open access to in-copyright material. So BHL is sometimes thought of as a heritage literature that's often old or just public domain, but we actually work to provide in-copyright materials available in a very open manner. We have lots of users, and that's one of the benefits of openness is by if you expand the access to your material, you'll expand your audience at the same time. And we have covered just about all of the areas of the globe with users of BHL, and about 110,000 a month. We also have a very active social media program. And again, openness provides the ability to share on social media and to engage and interact with audiences all around the world. And unless you can actually point to stuff, people really don't care as much to engage with you. Another key component of our open access and the ability to share is our work with the Flickr Commons and the Flickr community in general. We have about 121,000 curated images on Flickr. We have another 2 to 3 million images on Flickr as part of the Flickr Commons that are an uncurated portion. But by curating this collection, we can engage with an audience. We've had over 275 million views on that collection over the last 8 years or so. And the way we've engaged is through tagging that, and again, tagging it enables it to be reused because of its open licensing access. So again, we can flow that material into other projects such as the Encyclopedia of Life. Openness is also a challenge when you are working with a global community. We now have 37 actual sustaining partners of BHL that provide funding and staff support for this global collaborative, and over 60 partners on every continent except Antarctica. I joke we want to bring a scanner down to Antarctica, scan a book, and then we can cover all the continents. But again, getting on board 60 plus institutions that are often conservative to sign on to open is a challenge, but I think it shows the importance of the project and the importance of open that all of these partners are signing on to open. Openness also enables us to interact with another part of the biodiversity community. So again, we have a number of key partnerships from TADWIG, the Bioinformatics Standards Group, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, Encyclopedia of Life, as well as open library projects around the world, Europeana, which you heard from yesterday, and the Digital Public Library of America here in the United States. All of this is provided through the great staff that I have here at the Smithsonian that work on BHL and help to work with all of those global partners to ensure that we provide open access to all of our content. And of course, the work here by our own Smithsonian Library staff as being a key contributor of content to this BHL. You heard earlier from Anne about the different B declarations, Budapest, Bethesda, and Berlin. I'll add a fourth B to that, the BUCO declaration, which is for open access to biodiversity knowledge. The BHL is a signatory to the BUCO declaration, which asserts that biodiversity information needs to be open, needs to be accessible in order to be repurposable, reusable, and recalculable science. Another important part of openness is not just putting stuff out there. As Rachel was pointing out, machines really don't like to look at our pretty web pages very much. So again, BHL is a commitment to openness, which is important with our licensing of our data to make sure it's widely open and clearly available so that we can make available the metadata downloads, the full text downloads, and all of those types of different ways that machines can use these people. So again, in terms of democratizing access to knowledge, oops, take that back. BHL provides these are some quotes from our users. BHL provides access to literature that would otherwise be impossible. This is an important element of the metadata component of BHL. By making our metadata available, it's discoverable and findable by a worldwide audience. But then at the same time, by providing access to the actual real thing, we can actually help to democratize the access to knowledge. Many in the global south don't have direct access to our great libraries that we have in Washington, New York, London, Paris. So those researchers can spend their time working with their colleagues when they're visiting into those museums. They can spend time with the specimen collections, and they don't have to spend the time photocopying in a library. But I think what most resonates with me and really what makes me feel good every morning when I go to work is when I think about researchers like Leanne Reidman. And Leanne's quote about BHL was that by providing access to this, by being open, being available, it provides her with the gift of her own time. And I can't think of any type of quote about digitization that really hits home in terms of this age when we have limited resources, but our most limited resource is really time. And by providing time back to the world, back to our users, I think we really do provide a service. Just about 170 years ago, Charles Darwin and his colleagues, while trying to save the natural history library collections, then at the British Museum, wrote a letter that said that the cultivation of natural history cannot be efficiently carried out without reference to an extensive library. At about the same time, the Smithsonian was being founded, and it's really this element of providing access that we feel that the BHL has done by truly becoming the extensive, vast library of life that Darwin and his colleagues and our own James Smithson were thinking about when they were creating these institutions. So thank you very much.
So good morning, and I would like to congratulate the Digitization Program Office for putting together a terrific program, and importantly, for having the courage to invite the lawyer to be in the room where it happens. And yes, that phrase is copyrighted, and yes, I think my use is probably a fair use. So let me preface my remarks by saying that regardless of my personal views about open access, my job is to advise the Smithsonian on the legal ramifications and risks of digitization activities and associated policies, including access and use policies. And so while many of you are exploring the creative boundaries of digitization and opportunities presented by digital technology, I spend my time worrying about legal impediments to open access. And when a client asks me whether they can make their content available in open access, in my maddeningly lawyerly way, my answer is usually, it depends. My task today is to briefly highlight three obstacles that I'm calling obstacles to open access: copyright, contract, and privacy. So the first question to ask is the work protected? And I guess that I should back up and say that we have to ask a preliminary question, which is, what is the work that we're talking about? Is it text? Is it research data, metadata, images? Biological specimens may be treated differently than works of art. Is it video, metadata, software, and on and on? And museums have all of these kinds of content in their collections. And some of it's created by staff, and some of it is acquired from third parties. And that makes a patchwork of very complicated intellectual property questions. So for purposes of the open access discussion, it's important to draw these distinctions because some types of content, such as collections metadata, may be much more susceptible to open access treatment than other types, and there's really no reason to treat all content as monolithic. So once we define the work, determining whether it's protected by copyright is rarely an easy task. Copyright status must be evaluated item by item, and the process can be painstaking, arduous, costly, and often inconclusive. And here are the basic questions that need to be asked. And this is just a roadmap. When I get these questions, these are the kinds of questions to ask. So first, you're asking whether it's protected or not. And in figuring that out, you can determine whether or not it's in the public domain. I've identified here a number of museums that have decided to make all of their public domain content available in full open access. You heard from Alan Newman yesterday about the National Galleries project. And one question that often comes up is, if content is in the public domain, must you make it open access? And the legal answer to that is no. Public domain means the content is no longer protected by copyright. So that means that if you can get access to it, you can use it without worrying about copyright infringement. But the word access is very key to that, and so museums control access to their content. You can, if you choose, use terms of use and other kinds of conditions to limit, if you wanted to, the public's ability to use your public domain content. I'm not suggesting that anyone should. I'm just saying the notion that there's an absolute right to use public domain content is not really true. So then you decide, do you own the rights? If not, do you know who does? And if somebody else does, do you have permission to make that content open? If the works are protected by copyright, the next question is whether your use and distribution would fall within fair use. And as Anne mentioned, and was very heavily involved in the College Art Association project on best practices in fair use, and I've also been involved in the AAMD Fair Use Project, which is just in the very final stages of releasing the guidelines. Even if you don't own copyright, there may be circumstances when you may make certain content available under fair use. Now, in an open access context, I would say that to the extent you think of open access as making the content available to the public to use for personal, educational, scholarly purposes, much of your material, even copyrighted material, could be made available in that kind of an open access environment. To the extent open access means all uses without restriction, including commercial use, I think it's much more difficult to make a fair use argument. So after you've decided whether it's a fair use, then, and if you're not sure, then the question is, can you somehow mitigate your risk by passing the responsibility on to users? And many website terms of use you'll see will say things like, we make this available to you for personal educational use. If you want to use it for any other purpose, it's your responsibility to clear those rights. And that's one way a museum can protect itself when it puts its assets out there. So the next obstacle is and can be contract restrictions. And these are just a number of places where someone might need to look to see whether you have any restrictions. For example, you may have deeds of gift where the donor said, you can use this for X, Y, and Z, but you can't use it for A, B, and C. And if you have those kinds of restrictions, you may not be able to make that content available in a full open access environment. And it's very painstaking, as with copyright, to figure out possible conditions and restrictions, because they may come from deeds of gift, they may come from wills, bequests, licenses that you have that are limited, or contracts. Exclusive contracts may interfere with your ability to make content available in a full open access environment. And interestingly, a mention was yesterday about funders. Increasingly, funders are providing money for digitization on the condition that museums make this content openly accessible. And we've had some discussions with those funders because they want us to use a CC0 license, and we've said, well, how about if we use a CCNC license, because that's consistent with our terms of use that say we'll make it available but for educational, non-commercial uses. And we have found the funders to be relatively receptive. So if you have a museum that hasn't gone full open access, you might still be able to negotiate some limitations with your grantors. And the third obstacle I want to mention is privacy. We spend a lot of time, a lot more time, and maybe your institutions do as well, worrying about privacy implications, and particularly for things like archival collections that may have personal photographs and letters and a variety of things that may contain personal information. They may be business records that contain social security numbers. Before you digitize and put these things on the web in an open access or any context, it is important that somebody put an eye on those materials and make sure that there aren't private materials in there that could create potential risks in terms of infringing people's privacies or protecting personal identifiable information, and those kinds of considerations. And even though we do a lot of digitization of large collections, like archival collections, where my advice is somebody at some point in time should put an eyeball on just about every single piece of paper, because you want to make sure that you don't inadvertently publish something that has the potential to bring some risk to the institution in terms of infringing someone's privacy. The Smithsonian has a policy, SD 609, which is about our digital asset access and use policy. And we have a section of it that discusses what we call allowable restriction categories. And these are, in addition to copyright and contract, which I just mentioned, a range of considerations that we think about before we will digitize and make content available. And so there's as you can see in this list, including sacred sites, protected species, endangered species, those sorts of things. So these are considerations that a museum will look at before they decide what they should digitize and make available. And I just want to close with a quote from an article by Alice Meadows and the Scholarly Kitchen in response to a statement that open access is simple. While it's certainly true that the messaging around OA is simple, in reality, OA can be quite complex for everyone involved, authors, their institutions, publishers, societies alike. Different subject communities have different needs, and finding a way to meet all their requirements is far from easy. It's certainly not a case of one size fits all. None of this is to say that OA is a bad thing, only that it's far from as simple as it's claimed to be. Thank you.
I want to start by thanking our panelists, Martin, Rachel, Lauryn, for a really extraordinary set of presentations, very inspiring, very clear. And one of the things that I love about this particular panel is that we're lucky enough to have experts from different disciplines. And so as a place to begin our conversation, I'd like to ask all three of you based on your own experience and based on perhaps this morning's presentations, whether you feel that considerations for providing open access vary across the arts or cultural heritage sector where the humanities are concerned and in the sciences, and whether you feel that those types of considerations may have implications for developing broader open access policies at a place like the Smithsonian that is so interdisciplinary. And Martin, I'll invite you to begin since you're immediately to my right.
I'll actually start with mentioning a project that comes out of Switzerland and a group called Platzi. One of the things that they are trying to push forward is the fact that science is often facts, and facts are not copyrightable, and there's a lot of movement in that group to actually declare species descriptions, species habitation, and things like that as non-copyrightable facts, and therefore republishable, repurposable, even in the most contemporary publications with totally under open access because it's just a fact. So I think in some ways that's sort of a difference with science, is that a lot of science can be considered facts, and there are opportunities there to declare that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, one thing we spend a lot of time fretting about in the art world is copyright, and often that's retained by the artist. So there are limits to what we can do, but there's a great deal of material we could make freely available, as Alan Newman demonstrated yesterday. But there's also the great unknowns in our collections. Most of our collections, we really haven't done the research, so there are big gaps in what we know and whether we feel comfortable in releasing the information, or at least the image. And I would say, especially for the AAC project, we separated data from image, so we didn't have too much trouble coming together on releasing the metadata about our objects, but the images became the trickier question.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That in particularly watching these the presentations, I think the sciences, in a way, are much easier and lend themselves much more to the open access environment than, I don't want to say all the humanities, but certainly the arts and artwork, because it does have a very complicated copyright issue. But having said that, part of this AAMD project that I mentioned on fair use has specific chapters that deal with specific types of museum projects, and one of them is about collections databases. And if you read that, and we came to the conclusion, or at least the recommendation, that we thought an argument under fair use could be made that a collections database, even a collections database that includes images, now not necessarily full-page, highest resolution images, but something bigger than a thumbnail, but smaller than full page, might very well be something that could be defensible under fair use. So even if works are protected by copyright, there may be a way to rely on fair use to make them publicly accessible on your website. And I know museums have been doing that for a long time, but the AAMD used to have a thumbnail standard to say that that's what they considered was a fair use. They've repealed the thumbnail standard and replaced it with these new guidelines that are not really size-based, but really go to the context in which you're using the image to make sure that you're using only that much of the image that you need in the context. And in that case, there's a very good fair use argument.
Yeah, thank you so much. Prior to this morning's panel, the four of us had an opportunity for some conversation, an exchange of information. And one of the things that we had an opportunity to hear a little bit about from Martin and to read about is an initiative that he's been involved with, an open scholarship initiative. And he's been part of a working group that has developed a framework with the acronym DART, which I found extremely interesting. And DART stands for Discoverable, Accessible, Reusable, and Transparent. And that these may be principles, according to the thinking of this working group, that when distilled may help to provide a framework for thinking about open access. Often I know there aren't bright lines that we can easily turn to. So I found this notion of a framework for reasoning quite interesting, and I wondered if you might like to say a little bit more about its implications, and Rachel and Lauryn may also have thoughts.
Just as a little background, the Open Scholarship Initiative is a UNESCO-funded group. It's a 10-year project that's looking in ways to make scholarship openly available on a global scale, at the same time maintaining a platform for publishers, commercial publishers, to provide the different types of benefits that they do provide. Lauryn and I have talked about this a bit, and I think one of the key things about defining what is open, and as Lauryn mentioned, it's really a spectrum, and you need to define all of your open activities across a spectrum of things. So some things can be very open, in terms of, old public domain, U.S. government documents of a certain type, there's always a but, I know, when you're talking about copyright, to the things that are definitely in copyright, but again, as Lauryn again mentioned, there are sort of fair use elements that you can move around that. So I think really this sort of thinking about openness as a spectrum breaks us away from a very bitonal black and white view of openness.
I would agree with that thinking on that. It does remind me of some of the interesting discussions we got in the American Art Collaborative when we went beyond what we call the tombstone data, which is the basic captioning information about the object. And we were anxious for some of the partners to offer additional data, so research notes or curatorial notes. And our university partners started out in that direction, and then they withdrew that because they recognized that the students own the copyrights to the notes that they may have taken and made in the collection records, so they had to pull that back.
Rachel, that's a wonderful point, and I'm so glad that you've gotten at this question of what it means in thinking about open access for cultural heritage institutions really actively to be involving students and thinking actively about this relationship between openness and new opportunities to present data, to think about data, to mine data. And along those lines, as we think about what it means to tangle with this sticky wicket, and Lauryn, I think the point that you made at the end of your presentation, that it may seem simple in principle, but the devil may be in the details. I wonder perhaps if you could each reflect, based on your experiences, on whether you feel there are new sorts of best practices that all of us may benefit from, if not being able to adopt to the letter, at least thinking about in terms of principles, philosophies, and this may extend to thinking about topics such as metadata, thinking about how we present content, and perhaps also thinking about the nature of digital assets themselves. So how do we sort of reverse engineer this?
I'll start by saying one issue that came up in the American Art Collaborative is in trying to model our data against the ontology. That's the most common one that we would use in our field, which I mentioned is the CRM, Conceptual Reference Model of CDOC. And it's an event-driven model. Whereas most of our objects and the way we describe our objects are not framed in that same way. And so one question becomes, do we want to start to reshape the way we catalog and capture our information? And the second issue that comes up very strongly is in the collection management systems, which are all built in a certain way. How much pressure can we put on the vendors to help us be in a better position for, increasing access to our information by changing the way they structure their databases? So those are two things we thought about a lot.
I was very struck this morning when Ian was talking about, again, a simple concept, but the goal of making all of these collections accessible and interoperable and a way to use common language and common codes and so that all of these natural history collections can be used. And we tend in institutions and countries to be siloed to some extent, and we like to do things our way, and then we get invested in that way, and it's hard to branch out. And sort of one example that I deal with sometimes is in this standardized licensing scheme, like the Creative Commons, which for many years has very much been a standard licensing scheme. Not everybody adopts it, but a lot of institutions do. And now Europeana has come out with this very extensive list of rights statements. And I'm still myself struggling with how do the Creative Commons licenses and the Europeana rights statements intersect, interact, and why can't we just have one standardized system that sort of everybody accepts as the rule? And maybe we're moving in that direction, but that's a challenge, a real challenge of being able to make all this content that we so desperately want to make available and share, a way that we can do it on a global basis in a uniform or consistent way. And that's a great challenge, I think.
One of the key things I think is happening is that institutions are becoming a little bit more comfortable with risk management in terms of this. I also think intellectual property holders are realizing that by being too restrictive, they are losing a large portion of the population. So it's not just those who don't have the financial ability to access materials, but I just came from a meeting that was all about providing print access to the print disabled. And there's a huge swath of material that is under copyright but is not currently available in accessible formats. What are the ways that libraries and other institutions can help make print materials more accessible to those who either can't physically hold a book or who can't visually see a book? At the same time, there's in the museum community, we saw yesterday with the examples of, again, 3D printing that enables the visually impaired to actually touch objects. I think if intellectual property owners want to be relevant, they're going to have to also understand risk management, and that providing access is not necessarily giving things away just to their own loss.
Thank you all so much. I know that I still have lots of other questions that I'd love to pose to our panelists, and I am confident that the same is true of those of you in the audience, especially given the fact that open access has been such an important theme during this convening. So I would like to turn the floor over on that note to the audience to see what questions you all may like to raise.
Thank you very much for those comments, all of you. Thank you. I have a question for Lauryn. Are there different issues, legal issues, vis-a-vis 3D scanning and printing that we should be concerned about?
That's a really good question. And is Mike Weinberg here? Oh, he was here yesterday. He's written several articles about 3D scanning and printing. It's the other thing that lawyers say besides it depends is it's complicated. And I think that it raises some very interesting questions because a 3D project has many different components, and some of them may be some of the software that's used that may very well be open source, or it may be protected by copyright. The digital scans, whether they have their own sort of separate, like a digital surrogate, whether they have their own separate rights. I don't think there haven't been legal challenges that have really tested that, so it's hard to know. And then you talk about the finished print or the finished copy. In connection with 2D, the law is that a slavish copy of something is not sufficiently original to have its own separate copyright. So if you apply that in the 3D context and you say that what I've got here is a exact 3D replica of a 3D work, arguably that is not eligible for separate copyright because it's not original. But I think, Mike, you just walked in, and I can put you on the spot if you'd like to say something. The question was about rights in 3D copies and whether the intellectual property rights in the 3D copies and whether that's something museums need to be concerned about.
Yeah, sure.
Is that okay? Can I like turn the tables on you and put you on the spot?
That's fine. Yeah, so this is a little bit, in some ways it's a complicated question, in some ways it's a pretty straightforward question. Certainly under US law, the general theory is that new copies or copies of works don't get an independent copyright. And the idea essentially is the purpose, especially when you're talking about digitization, either 2D or 3D, the purpose of making the new copy, the digital copy, is to adhere as strictly as possible to the original. And so you as the creator of the copy, while you are doing a lot of work and you have a great deal of technical expertise, you are not injecting any new creativity into what you're doing. And actually, if you do that, you're sort of failing the purpose. And so if you just have a literal copy, or your intent is just to create a literal copy, you haven't created a new copyright. Now, that makes it easy if you're talking about something that you're scanning that's in the public domain, it's 300 years old. If you're scanning something that is still protected by copyright, even though you haven't made a copy, you've made a new copy that you own, you have made a copy of the original, and so you're potentially infringing on the original if you don't have the permission from the rights holders. But you as the kind of creator of the new digital work, don't have a right to it, and therefore can't license it out in any meaningful way. You can protect it with terms and conditions on the site that you're making it available, but you don't have a kind of copyright interest in that work.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we have a question from Twitter, so we'll take that and then we'll return to the floor.
This question is from Jarrett Smith on Twitter, and he asks, can the panelists share their best practices for determining due diligence for open access information?
I can do that very easily. I asked Lauryn.
No, you do more than that, Martin.
There's a workflow chart and
Yeah.
charts and boxes and arrows. It's really nice.
Yeah, there are a lot of some of the questions that I put out there. There's a lot of tools out there to help evaluate copyright. I think it's Cornell University website. Peter Hurdle used to be there. I don't think he's there anymore, but he did a great website for determining copyright. There's lots of places to go look. It's very time consuming, and I can tell you that it can be very frustrating because oftentimes you can't even after all your digging figure out with certainty what the copyright status in it is, because it depends when it was created, who created it, when it was published, was the copyright registered, was the copyright renewed, how long did the person who created it live, how many years have they been dead? I mean, if those of you who've done copyright research, you're probably nodding your head saying, yeah. But you can also make some generalizations. Works published before 1923 are generally in the public domain. So from a library standpoint, there's some pretty bright lines.
So there is a test I sometimes give. It's to ask myself, well, what's the worst that could happen? and in fact, I think it was Lauryn who once said to me, okay, we'll put it up. The worst that could happen is someone will ask you to take it down. You're not making money off of it. So if that's the worst that can happen, it's not so bad.
And
There is the worst that could the worst that could happen might be a lawsuit, but the truth of the matter is that, I've been here a very long time, and thank you, Anne, for mentioning how long that I've been here. But most people don't want to sue museums. They think that you're good actors and you're acting in good faith, and if you've done something that they're not happy with, usually you'll get a letter, and I've had many of those. You'll get an email, you might get a nasty phone call, and you just say, I'm sorry, I thought that it was okay to do that, and you take it down, and usually that's the end of it. And so I think assessment of risk is a very important part of it. At the end of the day, you do your due diligence, and if you still can't say for sure whether you can make something available, you know, you make a educated, I don't want to say an educated guess, but sometimes when we're dealing with works of art and we're really not sure of the copyright status and we think it might be in the public domain, but it happens to be an artist or an artist's estate that's very aggressive about enforcing rights, you may treat that work differently than you do a work by an artist or an artist foundation that's very supportive of museum digitization and reproduction. So it's hard to give a blanket answer, but I think that you can make some very educated assessments.
Just as, again, as sort of evidence of sort of incremental change, the Copyright Office just recently released some guidance on the fair use, Section 108, and actually adding the word museum to that in addition to library, so that the guidance would include museums as well as library in terms of under the fair use element of Section 108.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. There's one question that I just want to take from the audience, and why don't we let this be our final question, and following this, we'll invite everybody to come consult with individual speakers if you'd like to do so, but we'd love to take one final question. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting panel. My question has to do with finding these resources. And what we're looking at is more a general user, students, teachers, and the language is usually more academic, museum or for particular fields. So the example is students are looking for an ant and they don't know the Latin name, or they're looking for a photograph and it's listed as daguerreotype. So I understand it would be too complicated to go back to each individual description, but I wonder if you're aware or if there are any efforts being made to map a more common language against these more academic records.
Well, we did face that in the American Art Collaborative process. It is called reconciliation, and it was a way of taking the different terminology that each of the institutions used and putting some top layer across it that would be that more general layer, photograph, as you might suggest. And one way you do that, of course, is by tapping into other sources like the art and architecture thesaurus that the Getty has built, which is a hierarchy. And if you use that, then daguerreotype would be placed under the broader term for photography. So I think many museums do that already. We're not always so good at piping it out when we present our data, but we need to do a better job. That's a good point.
One of my favorite Confucian sayings is then the rectification of names becomes all wisdom. And in species identification, that's very problematic. And also finding those common names that match to species names is very complicated. If we had an ichthyologist in the audience, we could talk about how many types of species are called bluefish around the world. So there are a number of projects that are trying to do that overlay layer for ontologies and vocabularies, but I still think we have a long way to go to figure out which bluefish is on your plate.
Lauryn, do you care to add anything? Well, I want to thank our panelists for a really stimulating and very, very edifying conversation. Thank our audience members for great questions. And Diane, thank you again for everything you've done to make this possible.